wait for a moment if we have our audios and videos ready. And then we can start with the keynote speech very soon. Please be with us for a moment.
Yeah, hi Ashish, I can start?
Over to you, Tejasvi, please start.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Good evening and welcome all to the first session of webinar series on fortifications and military heritage of India, organized by our NSC Fort India. The session spanned for 2 days, include themes of Sultanate forts located in Deccan and forts in Maharashtra and Goa within the geographical region of Deccan. Today, we are starting with the session on Sultanate forts in Deccan, which are today part of modern day states of Maharashtra, Andhra, and Karnataka. They are true reflections of architectural prowess achieved by the patrons and builders of the fort in the form of defense features as response to military techniques and water supply systems during medieval period in India. Our keynote speaker today, Dr. Pushkar Soni, is one of the few experts on the defense architecture in Deccan and a great mentor to the scholars researching in this subject too. Dr. Soni is a chair at Department of Humanities and Social Sciences at IISER Pune. He has a bachelor degree in architecture from University of Pune. And excuse me, people, can you just switch on your audios? Thank you. Has proven research of Sultanate history and architecture. The research is recently published in the form of book, The Architecture of Deccan Sultanate, Courtly Practice and Royal Authority in late medieval India. His other published and in praise books are Aurangabad with Khultabad, Daulatabad, Ahmednagar, and Jewish Heritage of Deccan, Mumbai, Northern Konkan, Pune. Also, reading context in medieval architecture, Nizam Shahs of Ahmednagar. Dr. Soni has edited 5 books and a journal issue of South Asian history and culture, languages and scripts of South Asia in 2018. He has around 30 articles and a peer-reviewed book chapters, apart from several book reviews, regular newspaper articles, blogs, essays, documentary features. He is a life member of prestigious organizations, including Asiatic Society, Bombay Natural History Society, Bhandarkar Institute, History of Islamic Art Association, American Numismatic Association, and list just goes on. Today, Dr. Soni's presentation, titled Forts of Deccan, Changing Paradigms of Defense is an opportunity for us to understand the architectural responses to the changing military techniques as reflected in medieval forts in India. Thank you, Dr. Soni, for being with us. Over to you, sir.
Thank you. And good evening to everyone. If you cannot hear me, just type in chat and then I'll speak up louder. Thank you all for being here.
You are audible.
Thank you all for being here on a Friday evening when under normal circumstances, everybody would have things to do. But today I think I'm lucky to have a captive audience because there is not much we can do under this partial lockdown. So I'm very grateful for a captive audience that I have here. My talk today has a slightly changed title. It was announced as Forts of the Bahmanis, but is the screen being shared?
You can share the screen, right?
And I did not want to talk, just a minute, making sure that I'm sharing the screen. Share screen. Okay. And so the title of the talk has slightly changed. It is now Changing Paradigms of Defense, because I thought that speaking only about the Bahmani forts would be as boring as going to a museum and getting gallery fatigue at the end of it. We could go through a number of forts which all start looking the same and blurring into each other at the end of 40 minutes. And therefore, I thought I should put the forts of the Deccan, particularly those of the Bahmanis, but also later, into a much larger context that involves not just defensive architecture, but also settlement patterns, water management, and a sense of broader things happening in this whole region. Now, the Bahmanis are particularly important in the Deccan because it is in their reign from the 14th to the 16th century that we see the introduction of gunpowder and then the resultant changes in military architecture. What happens after the Bahmanis will also be briefly touched upon towards the end of today's talk. Now, regarding the studies on fortification in the Deccan, there are very few, one of which is a famous book by Sidney Toy. I think I have the other one here. But Sidney Toy wrote a book called Strongholds of India, in which he tried to discuss very descriptively some of the forts in India. Jean Deloche has published a number of books on the forts in South India. And then the last book I know of, which is actually a wonderful introduction, is Indian Castles in the Osprey military series, where they insist on calling what we call forts as castles, saying that the definition of castle is what fits these structures best. But we will talk of any primarily defensive military architecture as a fort for our purposes today. Forts also have secondary functions, but we won't delve into those. Anything that protects the entities that are important to a state by using military architecture is to be known as a fort. Now, people always have associated the introduction of gunpowder in India with the Mughals, saying it was at the Battle of Panipat in 1526 that Babur uses gunpowder for the first time. But this claim has also been challenged increasingly in recent years, as we know that gunpowder was used on the South Asian subcontinent, perhaps as early as 1300 by Alauddin Khilji in the siege of Ranthambore. We also know in the Deccan, as early as 1366, the Bahmanis have an administrative unit called the Karkhana-e-Atishbazi, which is not surprising since the Bahmanis are a splinter kingdom from the Delhi Sultanate, and they break away only in 1347. So they must have been familiar with gunpowder and its uses. But the first reference we find to the military use of gunpowder in the Deccan is from 1472 in the siege of Belgaum, in which the celebrated minister Mahmud Gavan, about whom we'll talk later, uses gunpowder. What's very important to note today is that we will be largely looking at forts in this big central area of a gently sloping plateau called the Deccan. It slopes from west to east and is bounded on both sides by big ranges of hills, the Western Ghats on the west being a much taller range of hills. And usually when people talk of forts, they like to talk of the forts in the Western Ghats, which are dramatic in appearance and have a lot of romantic tales connected with them, particularly in the foundation of the Maratha kingdom in the 17th century. But we shall concentrate on the forts in the plains of the Deccan, which are of a very different nature, and we'll see just why. But briefly, we cannot talk of forts in the Deccan without at least looking at a few pictures of the big fortified hilltops in the Sahyadris. And this is what they look like. They're absolutely dramatic. These are three forts called Alang, Madan, and Kulan in Nasik. And here you see that natural terrain is used to its greatest advantage in creating places that can be defended very easily. You do require a bit of building, but all you have to do is control a number of accesses to these hilltops. And you have a fort which is partly man-made and partly made by nature. With these forts, gunpowder is not a big concern till much later, when the British come with guns that can fire from the plateau below right onto these hilltops, which is how a number of forts eventually will get dismantled. A number of these forts in the Western Ghats were also built by the Bahmanis, the successor states of the Bahmanis, and then eventually a number of them were also built by the Marathas, who loved these forts as it fit their models of guerrilla warfare and fast retreat very well. These forts, if you can see it in this picture, you will see walls running along the hilltop. Again, we'll use the natural scarps very effectively, putting in walls only in a few places which are vulnerable to attack by people scaling these heights. And in fact, a number of tales of valor in the Deccan are associated by people who managed to climb up cliffs which till then were thought of as completely unsurmountable. Just like a dam is built in a way on a river so that with the smallest amount of wall, you can stop the largest amount of water. A number of these forts are built in a manner that with the smallest amount of walls, you can defend the largest amount of hilltop. And therefore, with these forts in the Western Ghats, what you'll see is long meandering walls because the geometry of the fort is dictated by the terrain. The shape of your hilltop, the shape of your scarps is going to define how the walls are going to gently curve around. And so finding these long meandering walls, these big, walled plateaus snaking out is very common in a number of these forts. But the forts that we talk of are not these forts. They really are forts in the middle of the plateau, which are not on raised ground. Very often, they're actually in a depression. And the reason for that is water is scarce across the plateau. And if you build your fort on low ground, very often this will be the place where water can be struck at a gentle depth. And so we are really looking at forts like this. This is the fort of Ausa in Latur district in eastern Maharashtra. And what you see here is a fort that's not on high ground. In fact, it is at a lower point in the plains. It's not enormous because there is no big hilltop which has to be protected. It's actually quite modest in size. And there are a number of architectural features that we'll talk about when we come to it. But this really is the nature of fort we are looking at. My talk today will have three components. I will talk about the implications of gunpowder and what it does in terms of settlement patterns and also in terms of water management technologies across the Deccan. The second part will be where we trace the changes in military architecture from the 15th to the 18th century, having already seen what has brought about these changes. And if we have time, the third part will really be to look at two exceptional forts which do not fit this general paradigm of forts in the Deccan plains. And so let's look at the first bit, which is the implication of forts. Of gunpowder on settlement patterns, on fortification, and on water management technologies. How are all these things connected? Not in very simple ways, but gunpowder technology changes very rapidly through the 14th, 15th, and 16th centuries, and even the 17th. And with these changes in guns, in artillery, in mining technology, forts change, the architecture of forts changes. You have all kinds of devices on fortifications that reduce the impact of gunpowder. But there comes a point when architecture is not enough to withstand these big guns, because gunpowder technology is changing much faster. Artillery is changing much faster than architecture can respond. And a result of which is, instead of reshaping the architecture to face these big guns, a lot of the rulers in the Deccan will change their settlement patterns entirely. They will disaggregate their settlements, and we'll see what I mean by that. Because of this disaggregation, they will set up cities in locations where water supply is scarce, and to overcome this, they will import large amounts of water management technologies from the same source that the gunpowder technologies are coming in from. And we'll see these relations very quickly. These are examples of the four kinds of things we are talking about that are connected. On the left, you have fortifications which have responded to gunpowder technology. There are additions being made to forts. You have a change in settlement patterns, which is indicated by the kind of gates you see in Aurangabad on top. You have changes in artillery and also in fixed guns, as you see in the gun at the bottom. And at this same time, you have a big change in water management technologies, as the siphon tower on the right will show you. Quickly, to go through a chronology of events, in the 14th century, you have the introduction of gunpowder in India. In the 15th century, you have the use of gunpowder in India on a battlefield. In the 15th and 16th centuries, throughout, you can see a number of changes taking place in artillery and also in the laying of mines to blow up forts, as a result of which you have changes in architecture. You also have at this time an introduction of water conveyance systems, which bring water over large distances. In the 17th century, you have the separation of forts from civilian populations, which are settled elsewhere. These water systems become very useful, but then later, most of peninsular India reverts back to old-fashioned water systems, which are wells and rivers. And in the 18th century, you have forts that are absolutely dull and unimaginative, mostly because they are not forts that can withstand big army attacks with lots of artillery. These are forts really to keep out small armed bands from attacking them. They're to protect traders. They're meant to be way stations and feudal mansions for small ruling families. Now, peninsular India and the Deccan are particularly special because there is a steady movement from a very early period right to the 17th century of people coming in from Western Asia and even Africa in large numbers to the Western seaboard. We know of people who come in trading horses. We know of people who come in as men of letters seeking employment with the various courts. And we know of people who come in as military adventurers seeking to find their fortunes fighting for one of the many kingdoms that populate the Deccan. We know of various people called Rumi Khan, who we know by the appellation of Rumi are coming in either from Ottoman lands or beyond. We also know of Central European gun technology moving in very quickly. I mean, everybody from the Ottomans and beyond is called a Rumi at this point. And one of these players who comes in and becomes the major minister of the Bahmani kingdom, somebody called Mahmud Gawan, is a very important actor in what happens with fortification in the Deccan. This was a minister who was called Malikud Tujjar because he also was famous for his trading activities. He was from Iran, and along with a lot of people, came to the Bahmani kingdom seeking employment. He did find his employment and became the most powerful minister controlling a large part of the northern Deccan. And as we know of this free movement of people, of skills, of trades and technologies coming in from West Asia, gunpowder technology came in this period under him and later very rapidly. So did the technology of conveying water and managing water, something that was in great demand in areas of Iran, a technology called building qanats, which is building these large underground aqueducts from springs onto lower ground. Now, we will look in the second section at the kind of changes that Mahmud Gawan brings about. But suffice it to say that architecture rapidly changes in response to the kind of gunpowder changes that are taking place. And at one point, instead of building bigger and thicker walls of forts, the rulers of the Deccan somewhere just decide to adopt an alternative strategy, and that of shifting settlements instead. So with older cities, what you have is what you see on the left, which is a large walled city in which there is a small citadel, and the whole civilian population lives in there, and they all live within these fortified confines. And it becomes very unwieldy to protect such a large population of people when guns are getting so big that with a single shot, they can knock down the walls. As a result of which, the whole civilian population is moved out to a different kind of settlement, and only the king and his military establishment and sometimes his treasury are protected in a fortified settlement. And I'll give you examples of this that happen. Here is the famous fort of Daulatabad, built in the 13th century as in the late 12th century as the capital of the Yadavas, then successively fortified by a number of dynasties, including the Khiljis, the Tughlaqs, the Nizam Shahs, and then eventually by Malik Ambar. This fort kept growing with concentric rings of walls, which kept an ever-rising population contained within protective walls. In 1610, Malik Ambar decides that he is going to actually move most of the traders and the civilian population outside. This will remain only as the stronghold of the administration and the military. And this is a very poor map that I downloaded from Google Maps. But on the top left here, you do see the fort of Daulatabad, which is partially depopulated to found a city called Khadki right here at a distance of about 10-15 kilometers to the east. This city will later be known as Aurangabad. Similarly, around the same period, in 1591, you have the fort of Golconda, which has been growing very steadily with large numbers of concentric walls, depopulated partially so that Golconda, which you see on the top left over here, gets partially depopulated to found the city of Hyderabad across the river Musi to the east. With the fort of Bijapur at the same time, you have the big fort with concentric fortifications with the royal center in the middle. And in Bijapur, this is your big city and the fort in the middle. There is an attempt to build a different royal center outside, a city called Nauraspur, which unfortunately doesn't take off because within 25 years, it's destroyed by the raids of Malik Ambar. And then, of course, you have the fort of Ahmednagar, which is from scratch, built completely disaggregated from the city of Ahmednagar. The fort of Ahmednagar never has a civilian population. All it houses is the ruler of the kingdom, his treasury, his garrison, and important parts of the administration. The rest of the city is really, if this is the fort, the rest of the city is on this side, completely separate from the fort. Now, what unites all these cities which get disaggregated from the fort settlements is that almost none of them actually have a city wall when they are built. We know that Aurangabad, known as Kharki when it's founded in 1610, does not have a city wall. Hyderabad does not have a city wall when it's founded in 1591. The city of Ahmednagar does not have a surrounding wall when it's built. All these walls are added by the Mughals much later, and the walls that the Mughals built in the late 17th or early 18th century are only ceremonial walls. They are not really military walls, and we shall see why. But good changes in gunpowder technology lead to changes in the military architecture in this region. At some point, the rulers very clearly think that you cannot keep improving military architecture beyond a point. What you do instead is you disaggregate your settlement, put the civilian and mercantile population outside, and limit the fortified part to serve the royal court, the treasury, and the garrison. Of course, hill fortresses in the Western Ghats still continue to be important through this period. Wherever you have them built, they continue to be strongholds of power, and they will be very useful, particularly for emergent kingdoms like the Marathas in the 17th century. The mode of warfare also changes completely, where you have large-scale field warfare, and you can see the artillery pieces here in a painting that shows the fight between Dara Shikoh and Aurangzeb. And it is this kind of warfare for which cities are not prepared at all, but they do not need to be, because you have a very different kind of financial system by this point in the late 16th, early 17th century, by which royal and imperial treasuries are not directly funding campaigns, but you already have portfolio capitalists, you have bankers who finance wars, and therefore no invader is really going to destroy any city because he wants the bankers and the merchants in that city to fund him and be on his side. And so the protection that cities enjoy is not military protection. What they enjoy instead is the protection of money. The Nagar Seth in later periods will pay off invading armies so as not to disturb the merchants. The other thing that changes enormously with this settlement pattern changing is the water conveyance system that I was talking of. And you really start having these systems of canals and aqueducts bringing water from large distances away. And the big reason is suddenly when a city is sited, not because of defensive considerations, but a site for a city is chosen because of its mercantile, because it's an important trade route. A lot of these places which were till then thought of as uninhabitable suddenly become possible as cities because you have technologies that can bring water from far away. So unless you had these technologies in place at the right time, forts or fortified cities would never have been disaggregated into military fort versus mercantile city. And they're very elaborate systems. I won't talk about them here because I'm afraid we might run out of time. And so to summarize what we are talking about in terms of really patterns of changing settlements, as opposed to a number of people who talked of European advances in military fortification being the reason for their superiority, I would suggest that what happens in peninsular India is that a very different strategy is employed. Instead of using resources to continually upgrade the architecture of forts, the rulers decide that they're going to change the paradigm of their settlements so as to protect what is important to them. And there are mechanisms by which the city and its merchants can take care of itself. Luckily, at this same time, the same vectors that bring to the Deccan military technology, gunpowder technology, and advances in fort architecture, these are the same vectors that will bring advanced technologies of water management. The last example of this kind of water management is in the city of Pune in the 18th century, built exactly on those same principles. Now, what happens in Europe at this time is really an enormous amount of theorization of how fortification should work. We do not seem to have a lot of theorization. Our forts are built by empirical rules. People realize that walls of a certain thickness collapse when they are shelled with cannonball, and they build them thicker. But there are certain things that do seem to come in from elsewhere, and we look at them very quickly. But in Europe, there is a whole geometry of forts that evolves because of this theorization. And people like Vauban are very important in this theorization. And so the profiles of forts that you see on the bottom in the center, on the left, you have the conventional round bastions or towers at the corners of a fort. And on the right-hand side, you have what evolves in Europe as the Thrace Italien, which is what we commonly call a star fort or a star-shaped fort. Forts you'll see with the Portuguese, the French, and the English in India. These forts are designed in a way on paper to eliminate blind spots completely. We do not do this. We do not invest our energies in this. Our strategy is very different, which is to change settlement patterns. And so this is re-emphasizing the same point. Now we look at actually what changes in terms of military architecture in this period of the Bahmanis from the 15th through the 16th centuries. And what you do have, we do not have textual sources that talk of artillery pieces or of the technologies to construct a narrative of how gunpowder was used. But architectural details, which are very datable, provide the evidence to support the movement of idea and technology in gunpowder. And so in the late 15th century, a number of architectural features suddenly out of nowhere appear on forts in the Deccan, all of which are innovations against the use of gunpowder. This upgradation is done on a large scale when Mahmud Gawan is managing the affairs of the Bahmani kingdoms. And these include things like parapet walls with merlons, the force bray, a barbican, ditches, and so on. We'll look at all these very quickly. But of course, hilltop forts keep continuing through this period. So it's not like naturally defensible places in the Sahyadris have gone. These are also very important, but they follow a completely different evolutionary trajectory. And even in the Deccan plains, you do have forts like the fort of Dharur, where on one side it's a land fort, and on the other side it's a hill fort, where the hill drops off very sharply into a valley. The biggest changes, which can be dated with some certainty, are the merlons or the crenellations, these little teat-shaped devices that you see on top of parapet walls. And these, the early ones, are very large because they're meant for archers who stand behind them, quickly get in between two of them, shoot an arrow, and move back. Later on, they keep becoming smaller with size. And as gunpowder becomes more and more commonplace, as you start having rifles and guns, loopholes or these holes through which you shoot people with rifles become the defining feature of battlements. Here in the fort of Daulatabad, as with a lot of other forts, you can see the changing profile of the fortified walls. So you see one line of merlons which has completely been filled in the 18th or 19th century, probably under the French. And you have merlons of a completely different shape. And the wall is also raised because, again, siege technologies have changed completely. And also defensive technologies have changed completely. And so what you see in a very, very late period is that the top of the merlons have sloping surfaces that slope outwards. The other big change you see in the 15th and 16th century is what is called a force bray, which is a rampart that is parallel to the main rampart, but at a lower height. And it also forms a thick buttress wall for the main rampart. So the advantage of such fortification is that the base of the fort wall is made massive because it's now really wide with the addition of the second wall. And there are also two lines of defense against invading forces at two different levels. The real disadvantage is if the enemy somehow manages to get to the lower line of defenses, they now have a place inside from where they can fight the upper line quite effectively. And that is why most forts also start getting a moat or a ditch all around the fort, which is very often flooded with water. In Bidar, it's particularly impressive because what you have is a triple moat. This presents an obstacle to attackers who come along the ground, but it also does not allow for easy tunneling below the ground to lay mines under the fort walls. You then have something called the counterscarp, which is on the outside of the moat. You have another wall which you barely see over here. And this wall also will have a passage or a gallery called a chemin couvert, or a covered way, where you can station your own troops. Now, all these changes take place very rapidly, sometime between the 1460s and the 1590s. And you really do not see them afterwards, and what you see afterwards is completely different. You start seeing in later periods a more expressive kind of architecture for forts, one that's not purely utilitarian, but more symbolic, which is supposed to impress people with sights, which is supposed to proclaim the legitimate rule of the ruler. It's not really something that's very effective against big siege guns. The last feature which appears under the Bahmanis and then dies out by the 17th century is what is called a glacis, or this sloping piece of land and earthwork which slopes up towards the fort walls. And the advantage of doing something like this is that the cannon cannot be aimed at the base of the fort walls. Their projectiles will fly over the fort walls. Also, it's impossible to gauge the height of the fort or the height of the moat when you're approaching it. So if you've been to the forts in Eastern Maharashtra, like the fort of Ahmednagar, it is impossible to tell at a distance as you approach it exactly how tall the fort walls are and how deep the moat is. And this is a drawing done by Yazdani of the fort of Baranda in one of his reports in the 1930s. And this shows most of these features that the Bahmanis and the sultanates after them built throughout the Deccan. What you have is a double rampart that forms a very thick base for the fort walls, which cannot be bombarded by siege artillery, mostly because the siege artillery is coming up these slopes on both sides. These slopes will not allow the siege artillery to aim at the base of the walls. The moat will not allow tunneling to lay mines. You have these two covered passages, 127 feet wide on the left and 150 wide on the right, where you can station your own troops outside the walls, and they will have defenses because of this earthwork called the glacis. And all this is very useful against gunpowder till artillery becomes bigger and smaller at the same time, by which you have small maneuverable guns which can be moved right up to the line of fighting. And at the back, you have guns that are so large that they might not be very accurate. They might not aim well, but they can certainly land shot inside your fort and cause a lot of havoc and damage. And the response to this, of course, is to give up on improving forts architecturally against gunpowder. It's to change the way you build forts and cities completely. And so these are the forts you see in the Deccan under the Sultanates. Again, these forts do have a kind of geometry. Some of them are round, some of them are square, some of them have regular sides. You see a double line of fortifications almost on all of them. You see these towers at regular intervals. Sometimes you have cavaliers or gun towers placed on the inside from which you can fire your own guns at the enemy outside. Most of them will have some kind of moat, and they will have excellent mechanisms by which they can use water. None of these forts will actually have a large civilian population within. There will be important trading settlements at a short distance away. So what you see at the bottom, Fosbury, Glacis, Ditch, Countercarp, Merlins, these are all the improvements that get made against gunpowder in the Deccan, which by the 1630s or 40s are all abandoned. And what you start seeing after that, we'll skip this bit on what happens in Vijayanagar, but what you start seeing in the Deccan Sultanates after that is very simple forts like this with single walls, no double walls, no Fosbury, because you know it's impossible. You can't keep building bigger and thicker walls because guns are going to keep improving throughout. And so in the 18th century, when you particularly get to a later Maratha period, you see forts like this, the Fort of Kharda, which are very simple. The designs are extremely predictable. They're all square. They all have towers at four corners. The forts are actually like the icon of a fort that you'll see on a map, or like a child would draw the map of a fort. They all have a small barbican in front. And again, they're not going to withstand a big siege. They're not going to withstand big guns. And we know in the 18th century that these kinds of forts regularly keep getting leveled against big armies. These are all for small garrisons. They're for temporary protection. You do not hole up in them. The Marathas in the 17th and 18th century, whenever they need refuge, will retire then to the only indefensible places against gunpowder, which are the hilltop forts. These are just small resting stations of which there is a big network. So you have these small protective islands. But if you're under serious attack, you run away to a fort on top of a hilltop, because it's not the architecture. You rely on natural defenses. You've given up on architecture as your defense against gunpowder. Another fort in Maharashtra on the plains, the fort of Malegaon, built in the 18th century, houses a very ugly school on the inside now. And this is what it looks like. In fact, most of these forts will look exactly like this, with a barbican and a number of towers. And these are not forts where you hold out against a big imperial army. Now, we'll quickly rush through a couple of exceptional forts, which are exceptional because they do not fit this whole paradigm. They do not go through all the changes that you see of the Bahmani forts. Well, the changes are not limited to that. They have unique features which are very different from the kinds of forts we've been seeing. The first fort is that of Janjira. I'll take questions. Somebody has raised a hand, but I'll take questions in a few minutes. Let's zip through this in about 5 minutes or so. The fort of Janjira is unique because it's on an island in the middle of the sea, not too far away from the mainland. But what's strange is what looks like water from the land is actually very shallow water. And so it's impossible to bring anything than a really small boat to come in here. So you can never have a sea invasion from this side because a ship cannot come into these waters. You have rocks within 6 to 10 feet. You cannot also have a land invasion because it's impossible to wade through this water. So the only approach is through small boats by which you cannot really mount an invasion. Remember, this is a fort that's built under the Nizam Shah's in the 16th century. It's massively upgraded in the 18th century, and it remains undefeated to 1948, when it's actually turned over to the government of India. It's turned over to the Archaeological Survey in 1972. Until then, people actually lived on this fort. From a distance, from the high sea, you will be bombarded constantly by the high ground in that fort, where you have a number of gun platforms that are pointing outwards. None of those gun platforms point inwards because, as we just said, it's impossible for an invasion, an effective invasion, to take place from the side towards the land. The other notable thing about this fort is there is only one entrance, and as you approach the fort, you really cannot figure out where it is because against the light, it's very well concealed. The entrance is from the landward side, so it's very rocky. You have to come in by a small boat. The entrance is not easy to see. There are slippery steps, and it's almost impossible for a hostile takeover of this fort by coming in, landing here with a large number of troops, using this single entrance as you're being shot at, and then getting inside. The fort also has 2 bodies of fresh water, which keep it alive. It's a small area, so there is an enormous amount of building. You have several 2, 3, 4-story buildings in there. Now, of course, all abandoned. And you have large numbers of guns, about which Dr. Garge can tell you about tomorrow, in the fort of Janjira. The other fort is the fort of Daulatabad, which we briefly alluded to earlier. A magnificent fort that sits on a small hill in the middle of a big plain, very strategic location, controlling most of the Deccan. You have some of these features that we talk of Bahmani forts, like the glassy and the force brain places, which you see over here. But it covers an enormous area. What defines it? This area also has a lot of palaces and ancillary buildings and so on. Lots of very impressive looking fortifications where you can actually date the same wall to different periods, given the kinds of additions you see over time. The most important and impressive part of this fort is the large moat which surrounds the citadel, which is this hill that sits right at the center. This moat is carved out of living rock, and so is this hill. So what you see there is again natural escarpment, and there is only one access to cross the moat and get in. And the minute you get in, you have to go in through a set of tunnels to go in on the inside. Again, a fort that cannot be won easily at all through the use of gunpowder, but you can get it by laying long sieges, which is what eventually will happen. Of course, the other story that goes hand in hand with most impregnable forts in India is a story of treachery and people betraying the fort. And to some degree, it does happen, but it's a story that's told a lot more than it actually did happen. There are certain kinds of stories that get tacked on, certain kinds of myths that get tacked on to all good forts. One is of how it was betrayed. Another one is how there is a tunnel from the fort to some location outside. But again, a lot of the stories that will be told to you in a number of these forts are common myths that are floating and can be attached to any fort, because conspiracy theories and myths are more attractive than the kind of mechanics of fort architecture, which can be very dull. You also have a number of gun cavaliers inside this fort. Again, just a few scenes of what you'll see in there. And as we are running out of time, I will quickly say a few things in conclusion. One is, in South Asia in general, and the Deccan in particular, great architectural changes were made to fortifications between the 14th and the 16th centuries. There was very little theorization of military architecture, as you could see in Europe in this period. And architecture maybe was just unable to keep up with rapid developments and improvements in gunpowder technologies of sieges and artillery. Or perhaps there was just a very conscious choice to shift the paradigm of urban settlements instead of building ever thicker walls in complicated geometric configurations. In either case, the result was that at the end of the 16th century, urban settlements, which were once housed in and around the great fort complexes, were now disaggregated into the royal court, treasury, garrison in the old fortified stronghold, and into a completely undefended new civilian mercantile town at a short distance away. There were several different economic, political, and social changes which would also sustain this separation. One of the inadvertent fallouts of this shift in settlement patterns was how water supply systems changed. Most importantly, by the 18th century, architecture has stopped being the main way in which you defend against gunpowder technology. In the Deccan, people have resorted to going back to natural defenses such as hilltop forts. And you have very simple forts, almost like American frontier forts with single walls being built everywhere across the Deccan Plateau. With that, I think I'm out of time, so I will stop and thank you. Let me just stop sharing. Yes.
Thank you, Dr. Soni. We do have some questions. I'll
Sure.
read out to you one by one.
Are these in the chat on the right?
Yes, they are, but you will have to find them out.
No, they're right here. So I can read them aloud and try and answer them. Would that work?
Fine, great. Yeah, sure.
Okay, so first question is, why was there a drastic shift in the paradigm of forts to such a pale or simple architecture, and they have given up against gunpowder and abandoned military architecture? Shouldn't it be improved with time? So there are two big reasons for this, one of which is gunpowder technology for guns changes very quickly. The sizes of guns, the accuracy of guns, the sizes of guns, instead of being larger, you actually have smaller and effective guns being made that can be brought right up to the walls. There is a limit as to how much you can keep upgrading your defenses. Building thicker walls, building taller walls takes some time. It takes a lot of resources. And again, you're not sure if it's going to work because in another 10 years, somebody is going to come with even more powerful artillery. And this is exactly what happens with the British. I mean, in the last Anglo-Maratha wars, the Marathas cannot hold on to their forts against the British because the British come with guns of a kind which the Marathas had never imagined. They never thought from the plains you could fire inside of a fort that's 1,000 feet high. And so it did make sense to give up on this and find a different strategy by which you protect what's most important to you. And the economy and the society have changed enough that cities and merchants can take care of themselves because nobody really wants to destroy them anymore. The second question is from, well, it doesn't matter who it's from. What is a king without his people? Yes, and so you do have a lot of civil unrest. And what you do have is that in this period, almost none of the kings are actually living in the city. They might live in very peaceful times, but their real stronghold is in a fort. For example, it's only as a British protectorate that the Asaf Jahs of Hyderabad, the Nizams of Hyderabad, will live in the city of Hyderabad. They're very happy living in Golconda for the most part. You look at something earlier, the Qutub Shahs will live in Golconda, not in the city of Hyderabad. The Nizam Shahs will live in the fort of Ahmednagar, but never in the city of Ahmednagar. In fact, there is one king who spends a night in the city of Ahmednagar, and it's so unusual that it's actually worthy of being chronicled, so which is how we know it. And even if you look at a lot of, the founding king of the Marathas, Chhatrapati Shivaji, also lives in a hilltop fort. What endears him to the population is a guarantee that taxation will be fair, there is general safety and law and order in his lands, and he will protect them when necessary against raids. But a lot of times they're just thought of as collateral damage. So when in this famous episode, Afzal Khan comes to get Shivaji, he sacks the town of Vai. He's troubling everybody around, but Shivaji stays very firm in his fort, saying, it's a tactical loss, but you have to bear it. And this does happen time and again. And in a sense, even as people, where are we today, leaderless, our leaders do live in forts which are far away, don't they? The network of Maratha hilltop garrison forts, is there a study on the network of these forts? There are several studies and there are several people who can brief you about it. There are a number of guidebooks written to how you can visit all of them. And again, if you write to me, I can put you in touch with written sources and people who can tell you a lot more. Now, instead of a question, somebody has told me that I have to scroll up further for the first question, which I will do. Which is, there are some questions right on top here. Let me just finish the question, the last question at the bottom, which is also a comment. The segregation of settlement from the fort, did it alienate people? Which I think we just covered. Now I'll go up to the questions which are on top. Where was gunpowder and cannons used first? We know they are used in the Battle of Raichur in the 15th century in the Deccan. I mean, we are talking about the Deccan here. We know gunpowder is used for mining, laying a mine under the fort wall of, well, we don't know if it's the fort wall, but it's used in the Battle of Belgaum in 1472. And so it very firmly in the 15th century, you do have gunpowder being used for warfare in the Deccan. Next question, who are the communities used to build forts? How do you see their adaptation to gunpowder introduction? Now, we do know that there are people who design forts and oversee forts, and these would be, I guess, today called military engineers, but I don't want to superimpose these labels retrospectively. But you do have people in charge of works. The masons are local masons who are coming from everywhere. And at the fort of Daulatabad, it's possible to see with mason marks that the people who build fort walls are also building buildings of leisure. They're also building palaces. They're also building. So they're just masons. They're told what to do and they build it beautifully. But there is a whole hierarchy of people above it. Somebody called the Sarekar, who is the head of works and so on. But again, I mean, several authors like Deborah Hutton and so on have lamented that there is so little documentary evidence. We've never really been able to uncover what these kinds of people are like. We don't know how this works. Connaught system in Pune, anyone who has undertaken documentation, one of the most comprehensive maps made of this system is by Pallavi Gokhale. And again, write to me and I'll put you in touch with her. Why was the depopulation of the fort adopted rather than additional fortification? Again, because this was a period in which you have a very different economic order. Trade is booming, cities are booming, there is massive urbanization, and the cities are also growing so fast that it's impossible to keep throwing up concentric rings of walls to keep everybody contained within a city, and also upgrading these walls all the time. And so, I mean, there are reasons we just spoke of as to why cities really do not get completely leveled. So when Shivaji raids Surat, he will extract tribute from all the merchants. They will burn the city, they will, but it's, I mean, all the violence is against people who don't pay up. Most of the invaders are very happy to negotiate a settlement and walk back with the booty. You don't want to indulge in unnecessary fighting. Isn't Tipu Sultan? Yes, I did not talk of this at all. Tipu is a very unique case at Srirangapatnam. You have a fantastic fort. You have a number of architectural features that are not really seen anywhere else in the Deccan. He's using a lot of French engineers to bring new technologies against gunpowder. And so he is exceptional in that he's decided to pick on a European mode of fighting, which is to keep building in new and improved theorized designs of a European pedigree. So he actually gets European military engineers to design things for him. So Tipu Sultan is very different. The granary and the magazines that you're talking of, he uses even a completely different set of construction technologies like Catalan vaulting. The decision of the depth of the moat, what does it depend on? I really do not know if I have an answer to that. But I suspect it would have to do with how much bedrock you can excavate. And if you hit a spring or something, you don't need to go much deeper than that. And I think we've zipped through all the questions. So
yes, we have one more question on Facebook Live. Do we know what kind of density we had in these forts, like Golconda, Janjira, or other Deccan forts? Ballpark figure?
In terms of population?
Yes.
They vary enormously, but it's not very large with the kind of, the kind of typical fort I showed you, whether it's Hausar, Dharur, and so on. I mean, we are looking at a few hundred people. And if the king is there, he will also have a big tent city outside. And so you also have to realize that there is a small settlement that moves with royalty everywhere. The Mughals are masters of this, where you go to a place called Alamgir, which is where Aurangzeb lives outside of Ahmednagar. And all you have is a small enclosure with a baradari from where the emperor will give Jharoka Darshan to his generals and troops, a small mosque and, a couple of other buildings like a gatehouse. And you wonder, how is he camped here with his big army? Well, this is just the core of the camp. There is a large tent settlement that comes up all around where he is and also travels with him. So it's very difficult to estimate numbers unless you have written sources, because a large part of the garrison is highly mobile and camped as per where they are needed.
Thank you, Dr. Soni. I guess we are running out of time. It was very kind of you to take almost all the questions. Thank you very much. Over to Ashish. Ashish, you can take forward. Thank you.
And somebody has asked about,
please go on.
The typology of forts on the coastline and in the Konkan, and I believe Dr. Garge will address that adequately tomorrow.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you so much for being quick in terms of responses. It was an excellent presentation. I guess everybody enjoyed it a lot. A lot of people have really loved it on Facebook as well. I've already put my request to the team to put the first part of this recording on Facebook tomorrow. And let's meet again tomorrow with a very interesting discussion and region that we are going to explore with Dr. Garge. See you, and thank you so much, Dr. Sohani, again. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for joining. Thanks, my team. And thank you to ICOMOS as well for making this platform available. Thank you.